The widow stood alone at the far end of the dusty street, a thin figure wrapped in black, her boots worn smooth by years of walking the same path from her cabin to the market and back. Most folks in town barely noticed her anymore. She had become part of the scenery, like the old hitching post or the crooked sign above the saloon. People said her name with pity when they said it at all. Old widow. No children. No husband. Just a quiet woman living on the edge of town with a small piece of land and a weather-beaten house. What they didn't say was that she had once been one of the fastest hands the frontier had ever seen. Her name was Eleanor Graves, though once upon a time, men had whispered it with fear instead of sympathy. Now, the whispers had faded, replaced by the cruel confidence of three men who had ridden into town that morning looking for easy money and softer targets. They were brothers, or at least they claimed to be. Tall, loud, and dressed like they wanted everyone to know they carried guns for a living. Their laughter filled the saloon before noon, and by mid-afternoon, they had already started trouble with the shopkeeper and one of the ranch hands. The sheriff had tried to keep an eye on them, but he was alone, and they were three. Experience told him to wait, to let them drink themselves tired and hope they rode out by morning. That hope died the moment one of them noticed Eleanor. She was leaving the general store with a small sack of flour and dried beans when the tallest brother leaned back in his chair and laughed. "Look at that," he said, loud enough for half the street to hear. "Easy pickings." The second brother squinted, then grinned. "Widow, ain't she? Lives up by the creek. Folks say she's got a bit of land. No man to guard it." The third didn't smile. He just watched her, eyes narrow, something uneasy stirring behind his bravado. "Don't know," he muttered. "Something about her." The first brother waved him off. "You're seeing ghosts. She's old. Alone. Perfect." Eleanor felt their eyes on her before she heard their boots. Years had taught her to notice small changes in the air, the way silence bent just before trouble arrived. She didn't hurry. She didn't slow. She simply kept walking, her spine straight, her gaze fixed ahead. "Ma'am," the tall one called out. "Mind a word." She stopped and turned, her face calm, almost gentle. Time had etched lines around her eyes, but they were sharp eyes, steady and clear. "What do you want?" she asked. The second brother stepped closer, smiling like a man who enjoyed watching fear bloom. "Just thought we'd walk you home. Dangerous town these days." Eleanor's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "I've walked these streets longer than you've been alive." The tall one laughed again and reached out, fingers brushing the edge of her sack. "Maybe so, but you look like you could use some protection." That was when the street grew quiet. Windows closed. Doors creaked shut. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The sheriff stood at the far end of the street, hand hovering near his badge, knowing he was too far away to stop what was coming. Eleanor set the sack down gently at her feet. "I don't need protection," she said softly. The tall brother's grin widened. "Everyone needs protection." She met his eyes then, really met them, and for a heartbeat, something flickered across his face. Doubt. But pride smothered it just as quickly. "What's that on your hip, widow?" the second brother asked, nodding toward the slight bulge beneath her shawl. "That's some kind of keepsake from your late husband?" Eleanor's hand rested lightly near the fabric. "Something like that." The third brother shifted his weight. "Let's go," he said, unease creeping into his voice. "This ain't worth it." Too late. The tall one reached for his gun. He never touched it. Eleanor moved like memory given flesh, like a story unfolding exactly as it always had. Her hand swept aside the shawl, and the old revolver seemed to leap into her grip. 3 shots rang out, sharp and final, echoing off the wooden buildings like thunder. The first brother fell backward, his gun half drawn, surprise frozen on his face. The second staggered, a red bloom spreading across his chest as he collapsed into the dirt. The third brother's weapon slipped from his fingers as he dropped to his knees, a cry tearing from his throat before he fell forward, unmoving. It was over before anyone had time to scream. Smoke curled lazily from Eleanor's revolver as she stood there, breathing steady, eyes scanning the street with a soldier's instinct. When she was certain there was no more danger, she lowered the gun and slipped it back beneath her shawl. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the sheriff ran forward, his boots pounding the dirt. He looked at the 3 bodies, then at Eleanor, his face pale. "Eleanor, what in God's name?" She picked up her sack and met his gaze. "They tried to rob me. And worse." He swallowed hard and nodded. He had seen enough in his years to know the truth when it stood in front of him. "You're not under arrest," he said quietly. "Not today. Not ever." She inclined her head in thanks and turned to leave. "Mrs. Graves," someone whispered from a doorway. "I didn't know." "No one does," she replied gently. As she walked away, the town began to breathe again, voices rising in hushed awe and disbelief. Stories spread faster than wildfire, each telling growing a little larger, a little bolder. By nightfall, folks said she had faced down a dozen men. By morning, it was 20. But Eleanor didn't listen. She returned to her cabin by the creek, set her supplies on the table, and sat down in the quiet. The past had a way of catching up when guns were drawn, and tonight it knocked louder than usual. She closed her eyes, and memory took her back. She had not always been a widow. Once, she had ridden beside her husband under a different name, her hair braided tight, her gun worn proud and visible. They had been law in places where law feared to tread, hired guns with a code, faster and fairer than most men dared to be. She had outdrawn men twice her size and twice as cruel. They called her names back then, half in fear, half in disbelief. Then one job went wrong. An ambush. A bad town. Too many guns. Her husband had died in her arms, the light leaving his eyes as she begged him to stay. She buried him herself and swore never to draw again unless she had no choice. She took his revolver, wrapped it in cloth, and disappeared into a quiet life where no one asked questions. Until today. That night, a knock came at her door. She reached for the lamp, her hand brushing the hidden gun out of habit, then paused. "Who is it?" she called. "It's the sheriff," came the reply. "And most of the town." She opened the door to find a crowd standing awkwardly in the moonlight. The sheriff cleared his throat. "We brought you supper," he said. "And apologies. We should have looked out for you better." Eleanor looked at the baskets of food, the bowed heads, the nervous respect in their eyes. "You didn't know?" she said. "That's how I wanted it." A woman stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for showing us that strength don't always look the way we expect." Eleanor smiled then, a real smile, warm and weary. Strength is just knowing when to stand and when to stay quiet. The crowd left her with food, lantern light, and something she hadn't felt in years: peace. By morning, the three men were buried at the edge of town, unnamed and unmourned. Their horses were sold, the money given to families they had hurt along the way. The saloon was quieter after that. So was the street. Eleanor returned to her routines, but something had shifted. People greeted her now, not with pity, but with respect. Children waved. Ranchers tipped their hats. No one bothered her again. And sometimes, when the sun dipped low and the creek whispered its secrets, Eleanor would sit on her porch and rest her hand near her shawl, not in fear, but in remembrance. She had lived a life sharp as gunfire and learned the cost of it. She had earned her quiet. They had thought the old widow was an easy kill. They were wrong. And the town would never forget the day they learned just how dangerous it was to mistake silence for weakness.